Listen closely and do not look away. This is the kind of secret your uncle warned you to avoid and the kind your history books were never allowed to whisper. It begins with bones found under a kitchen floor and ends with a name erased and then painted back into the margins of memory. You will hear names that make a town tremble and details that respectable people pretended not to see. Keep your mind sharp and your instincts sharper because this is a descent and you will be changed by what you learn. There are places where geography folds like a fist and families fold inside it like secrets. Western ridges hold bloodlines that double back on themselves and keep their own counsel. Jacob Elbridge was born to no father listed and to a mother who never left the ridge and who carried the hush of something older than shame. She moved with rules that sound like scripture in the dark of the woods, and she raised him not as a son but as a reflection of herself. By adolescence he was tall, pale, silent, and unnervingly precise in his habits. Neighbors said the wind seemed to listen when he walked and that animals stilled in his presence. When the town doctor entered the house and later could not eat a meal in public again, the record books quietly shifted to forget what had happened here. This is not a cautionary tale for the faint of heart. This is a lesson about how power hides in the most intimate places and how institutions prefer tidy narratives over messy truth. They will call it folklore, they will archive it as hysteria, and they will erase the paper trail when the reputation of their town or their bank or their church is threatened. But physical evidence resists erasure and bones speak eventually in ways that make record keepers uneasy. You are not a passive observer here. Lean in as if someone is placing a key in your palm because what follows will instruct you how the circle closes and why the line between protector and predator is thinner than you imagine. Pay attention to the small details because the twist lives there, and because once you see the pattern you cannot unknow it. Now you must learn how small corruptions become systems and how a single household can warp an entire town into silence. Start with proximity and a shortage of witnesses. Isolation is the first instrument of control. When a family lives where the road ends and the forest begins, there are fewer eyes, fewer chances for gossip to become evidence, and more room for a story to be enforced as truth. Jacob and Sarah built isolation with fences and habits that discouraged neighbors from watching too closely. They offered favors to fishermen and tradesmen, they bought silence with bread and coal and framed hesitation as eccentricity rather than cruelty. Next comes the ritualization of private acts into public creed. What begins as odd traditions around the hearth becomes codified in songs told to children in whispers and then repeated as warning to outsiders. Objects became anchors of meaning: a carved ring, a stitched portrait, a circle of mirrors, all designed to fix identity and rewrite kinship as circular and closed. Thirdly, somebody creates a narrative and insists everyone accept it. Records get altered, births stamped with different years, a tax ledger becomes incomplete, a clerk scratches out notations. Those who provide services, the blacksmith, the gravedigger, the teacher, are coaxed into complicity because convenient silence has a price and reputations can be threatened with half words and harsh looks. The professional class fails first because they trade moral courage for a paycheck and a quiet life. Watch how superstition and bureaucratic inertia collaborate. A doctor paid by a patron will reclassify an infant death as natural, and a coroner who fears scandal will misfile a report. This is how structures cover crimes with the cloak of legitimacy. And then there is the personal engineering of a child to be both object and heir. They taught Jacob to mirror his mother, to mimic her inflections, to accept praise as marriage vows, and to internalize voices that were never his own. Parental domination became worship, and the household a factory producing a single outcome, a mirror reproducing itself. Remember the power of everyday choices, small gestures enforced over years that calcify into destiny. Those are the levers you must learn to spot, because systems cannot hide forever and they always crack at seams made by human error and moral fatigue. Next section follows the crack where truth begins to crawl out slowly. You are learning to read how a single household becomes a small state and how rights and records become instruments of secrecy. Listen as I show you what breaks first and why truth always finds a seam to widen. First, the small betrayals, private acts framed as necessity, debts repaid with favors, favors repaid with silence, silence repaid with obedience. These are the currency of control, and they accumulate unseen until the ledger tips and a pattern becomes visible to anyone who will look closely. Then the family fabric becomes a script written by its most ruthless member, a script taught to children as manners and to servants as policy, repeated until it sounds like custom rather than coercion. They convert affection into obligation, and obligation into an obligation that cannot be named aloud. Notice how they weaponize kindness, the way a loaf of bread or a winter coat can buy a lifetime of complicity, how gratitude becomes shackles dressed as charity. Next, watch the professionals falter, the man with a ledger who erases a line, the minister who reads a different prayer, the doctor who calls an unnatural death a misfortune. These die in small increments until a whole town forgets to ask difficult questions. And when someone does ask, they are met with a wall of propriety, a chorus learned in the parlors of power that says, do not pry, do not speak, do not endanger reputations above truth. But there is another path that opens in the cracks, a path made of stubborn facts and small refusals, the neighbor who keeps a date in a diary, the maid who hides a scrap of thread, the photographer who writes notes in the margins. These tiny resistances are the grain that will split a log. They are slow as rot but inevitable if tended by curiosity and courage. You must learn to value them, to follow paper trails and gossip with professional skepticism, to treat superstition as a clue not a dismissal, to read a child's expression as a data point not a ghost story. When the outer world finally presses, and it is rarely loud and cinematic, it is forensic and patient. It is a pattern recognized by someone who knows where to look for the seams between ritual and crime. A burned ledger, a cautious letter hidden under floorboards, a photographic negative catalogued with a trembling note, these are how silence is translated back into testimony. Remember always that secrecy prefers the small light, the dim bulb in a kitchen, the curtain carriage, the polite cough that clears a room. Truth prefers light too, but it requires one brave person to open a window and let it flood in. That is where the next section goes, into the investigators who begin to pry and the reactions from a town built to remember nothing. Now the microscope arrives, not the kind that looks for bacteria but the kind that peels back a life to its ledger and its lies. Investigators come in neutral coats and quiet voices, they bring lists and permissions and a patience that smells of late nights and coffee. They follow the seams you have already found, the marginalia, the negative in an archive, the ledger entry that refuses to line up with a story that has been told for decades. Watch how institutions react when pressure turns polite curiosity into inconvenient proof. Notice the reflex to protect reputation first and truth second. Observe how loyalty to an image outweighs duty to fact. They will call you unkind if you press. They will call you a sensationalist if you publish the contradictions. They will offer small consolations like a press release or a commemorative plaque to silence the deeper question. But evidence has its own stubborn logic, fingerprints in wallpaper that do not wash away with polite apologies, chemical traces that tell stories about what a body experienced, photographs that record micro-expressions a liar cannot control. In this phase the narrative shifts from rumor to archive, from gossip to chain of custody, and the people who once posted polite photographs on parlor walls become subjects in a file with numbered exhibits and provenance notations. You will learn to read how power buries itself under ceremony, how funeral rites become cover stories, how donated portraits are accompanied by careful deletions in wills and by signatures that vanish under scrutiny. And halfway through this descent I need you to do something that seals your attention and aligns you with what comes next. Go down to the comment section now and type the phrase "I am the light" 2 times to mark that you refuse to be led by illusions and that you will return to this channel with eyes that do not look away. This is not a gimmick, this is an exercise in identity. Say it twice and mean it and watch how your mind settles into a witness stance rather than a spectator one. Back to work. The confrontation is procedural at first, subpoenas and polite refusals, then it becomes personal. Relatives who once smiled in group portraits now avoid the room where the photograph hangs, old friends who ordered flowers for a funeral refuse to answer letters, and the town archivist places certain boxes on a shelf marked fragile and off limits. Yet every seal has a seam, every unmarked box a loose nail, and a single persistent voice will find it. A maid's note left in a dress, a photograph negative misfiled, a name typed twice in a ledger where only one signature belongs. When those seams widen, the story accelerates, and the weight of small truths topples institutional inertia. The next section will show you how confession and cover-up collide, how reputations fracture, and how the darkest histories never vanish. They simply wait for someone with a magnifying glass and the courage to ask why. They come for you with charity and condolence and a polished narrative dressed to reassure. They call it closure and reconciliation, and they hand you a ribbon ceremony to distract you from the ledger. Records and memory do not vanish because someone crafts a nicer epitaph. Listen as the public story fractures into 3 parts. First, the denial disguised as concern. Second, the deflection dressed as expertise. Third, the attack that lands personal because it is personal. When coroner files are unsealed, the language is clinical yet lethal in what it reveals. Bone anomalies recorded by a paleopathologist that cannot be read as age or malnutrition. Dental patterns that match no local dentist work. Microfractures and ribs that map to repeated blunt force rather than an accident. The paper trail becomes a map of choices, not mistakes. Insurance payouts and quiet transfers reveal motives that sound ugly when spoken aloud. And the more respectable the names attached, the louder the protective chorus becomes. Editorials arrive about tragedy and temperament and how privacy must be respected. They place soft narratives where hard evidence should live. They call experts who will say photographs are ambiguous and grief is messy. But photographs are stubborn witnesses, and micro-expressions do not change with op-eds. A tiny handprint in preserved wallpaper does not reconcile with a press release. Translation becomes the work of the insurgent historian. You translate fear into evidence and rumor into a timeline. You learn to connect minutiae across ledgers and maps and letters. You recruit allies who will not bow to comfort over truth. Archivists who open sealed boxes, pathologists who test fragments, reporters who verify instead of soothing. Together you create a counterweight to an institutional machine that prefers tidy endings to accountability. Threats arrive like storms. Anonymous notes, a cracked window, a vehicle that dies at night. Sometimes the threats are medical and economic. A grant frozen, a curator reassigned, a donor who withdraws. You document every interference and you use their systems. You file complaints, you publish findings, you build public pressure. Cracks widen until light passes. A closed council meeting opens under scrutiny. A sealed will is examined in court under public gaze. Relatives who once shielded a name now step forward with new memory and shame. By the time a reckoning arrives, institutions survive but reputations fracture. Next section reveals the human cost of truth. You have descended so far that the small consolations are gone, and now only the architecture of truth remains exposed and sharp. You know the instruments that carved silence into law, the ledgers that traded bodies for balance sheets, the polite hands that tied memory into knots. Now meet the survivors, not the famous ones but the keepers of fragments, the archivists who risk reputation for a single ember of proof, the ex-detectives who refuse to fold files into tidy drawers. They arrive slowly and they arrive in pieces, a brittle photograph here, a hidden ledger there, a testimony given with hands that tremble but refuse to lie. Each fragment is a stitch in a wound that refuses to heal until named and set in light. This work is reclamation, not vengeance, though vengeance walks nearby and watches with hunger. Learn the ritual of slow proof, the way evidence must be assembled so it cannot be dismissed as coincidence or sentiment. Start with pattern, then motive, then opportunity, and finally the simplest human act, confrontation. Gather witnesses whose memory is uncool, whose lives are ordinary, inconvenient to those who profit from silence. Protect them with public light and legal scaffolding, remove the cozy veil of private shame that shields the guilty. Learn how institutions bend under pressure when an audience is wide and attentive, how donors pivot and how trustees who once whispered suddenly produce statements. Do not mistake spectacle for justice, yet do not underestimate the power of exposure. A name read aloud in a council meeting can crack a foundation that seemed permanent. A photograph enlarged and shown to a city will demand explanations that polite letters cannot provide. You will be urged to wait, to trust process, to accept experts who owe favors. Do not accept the invitation to patience unless you control the pacing. Control pacing by leaking facts in measured doses, by building alliances in public life, by converting moral outrage into concrete legal steps. When the first conviction cannot be won because time has eaten statutes, win the jury of history instead. Force the record to change, force plaques to be rewritten, force genealogy books to acknowledge names that were erased. When memory is corrected, descendants no longer carry a secret like a curse, they carry a truth that can be worked on and healed. This is practical cruelty of truth. This is the last descent and the sharpest revelation, the point where the map of horror folds into history and becomes a responsibility that cannot be dismissed. You learned how silence is manufactured, how reputations are curated to hide violence, how money and manners make apologies for murder. Now consider how to transform exposure into structural change, how to convert a single photographic truth into a shield for future innocence. First, insist on record correction. Insist that archives and registries reflect reality. Force every ledger that was rewritten to show the original entries. Demand memorials for those erased, small markers in public spaces that break the polite amnesia. A stone alters what a neighborhood remembers. Push institutions to answer, not with bland statements but with investigatory commissions that publish names and methods. Make processes public and records accessible. Build networks for witnesses, journalists, archival specialists, lawyers and citizens who refuse the luxury of forgetting. Train them in evidence preservation and trauma-aware interviewing. Legislate limits on secrecy. Tighten statutes so records cannot be quietly altered. Insist on independent oversight when historical crimes are implicated. Use the court of public opinion wisely. Do not drown the record in spectacle. Amplify the most credible fragments and let them compel institutional response. This is heavy work that requires moral discipline and patience. You will be tempted to crush opponents with exposure alone. Resist that urge and preserve the chain of evidence. Consider the human work of repair, reparative measures that do not pretend to erase harm but that create future opportunity for families harmed by the crimes of power. Scholarships, land restitution, named foundations that fund social programs. Each practical measure interrupts cycles of extraction by elites. Remember, truth is a compass, not a sword. It guides decisions and shames the comfortable, but it must be wielded with care or it becomes another instrument of domination. If you want to act, start with a photograph, an assertion, a note, then assemble the rest with care. Let history be corrected by accumulation of proof. If you want to learn, watch how archives breathe when exposed to light, how institutions flinch and then change. If you choose to forget, do not pretend you did not choose it. Understand that forgetting is an act that serves somebody's power. Close your ears to platitudes and listen to the evidence. It is the language of justice.